Hello and welcome to Upper Pen. My name is Dakota, and today I am talking with Seth Ring, author of the Nova Terra LitRPG series. Thanks, Seth, for being here.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
So I'm gonna let everybody know I got to this party pretty late. I didn't find Nova Terra until March 9th, and now I'm on book 5, so it's been a journey. Um,
That's pretty
yeah,
quick to go through them.
Yeah, so my day job is a lot of downtime, and so I listen
Okay.
to books there,
Oh, awesome.
but I love them so much. I love them
I'm
so
so
much.
glad. That's very kind
Um,
of you.
how did you get started with Nova Terra?
Sure. So, my day job before I became a writer was in IT, and I had been thinking a little bit about video games and AI in particular, and how AI would handle somebody whose body was sort of outside the normal scope of like what a regular person would be like. Because at the time I was reading a bunch of lit RPG, and so I was reading books about full immersion virtual reality. And I thought to myself, oh man, I wonder what would happen if you took a character that was like really far outside the norm physically and you put them into one of these worlds. And so that's sort of how the idea was born, and I sort of took it from there.
I love that the characters can't change their appearance more than, what is it, like 20%?
Yeah. Yeah.
So that like gives like such a real world vibe to most things.
Yeah, and part of that was just a matter of sort of um I apologize. One second. My dog is now scratching at my door.
Oh, you're okay.
All right. So part of that is just that I wanted to be very clear about sort of who everybody was and what identity they were bringing into the game. And having grown up playing video games, especially online, I knew how easy it was for somebody to sort of pretend to be something that they weren't. And so rather than have to deal with the like trouble of that and everybody sort of being like jaded, well, they're probably not who they say they are, or like main character is probably not that big in real life. He's probably, um, I just thought that it would be easier to say, no, let's just lock everybody into sort of being who they are. And then as the series progressed, it turned out to be really good that I had done that, sort of because of the direction the story went.
Yeah, so like because the real world in the book is so intertwined in
Mhm.
Nova Terra, it just makes sense that they would be like identifiable basically
Yeah,
in Nova Terra.
absolutely, absolutely. Now I do, the one sort of gray area is that they can change their race, so they can become a fantasy race, because like you can't have a fantasy game and then not let anybody be anything but human. Um, and so they can carry some of those characteristics with them when they're going into the other virtual spaces like Fantasia. But overall, they have to sort of keep themselves as who they are.
Yeah, and I don't know, I just love the that as an aspect because a lot of fantasy like or lit RPG, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
is you completely change what you
Right.
look like. So you get like Montana from the bad guy or the good guys,
Mm-hmm.
and he's like this super buff guy, and you're like, oh, everybody wants to be the tall, dashing.
Yep.
um,
Yeah.
and then there's Thorn trying to make himself shorter.
Yes. Well, and that was just a really fun thing to play with. And so actually that came about for um, a slightly different reason, and that's because the first version of the story I wrote, Thorn actually successfully shifts his height down to normal size, and so nobody knows, like, yeah, and so he's just a really, really like abnormally strong person at normal height. And then one of somebody was reading the story and just said, really, you have this great character, and then you just took away like the best thing about him. And I thought to myself, all right, I guess I'll just lean into it. And so I went back and I rewrote. and had him trying to adjust his height down and then not really being like, well, what's the point? And then he just sort of enters the world again as he is and starts to discover who he actually is as that, as that unfolds.
Yeah, and then you have a ton of character progression in these books, which is impressive for a lit RPG because usually you just get like stats and like adventure, but a lot of this is character driven with Thorn and his friends, Mina and like Mina just comes to mind. She's funny.
Yeah.
But Thorn, so I'm on book 5 now. And at this point, he has fully embraced using his aunt's connections as like the most powerful person. And he's like, yeah, no, it's fine. It'll be fine. They'll show up.
Right.
So I love that transition from the very beginning where he's like, I don't want anybody to know who I am ever.
Yeah.
To fully embracing it.
Yeah, I think that as we go through life, we either sort of reject who we are and we fight against it, or we end up embracing it and trying to move forward in a positive way based on who we are. And I think I wanted to take Thorn on that journey specifically because I think it's important to recognize that, as you grow, you can change your mind. Like, you don't have to be the same forever. Like, you will grow and you will mature. And I just really wanted to see that with Thorn, especially because I started him so young, right? As a character, he starts very young, very immature, very naive about the whole world, and has this sort of rosy picture of what life is like, despite having gone through some struggle himself. And I just wanted to kind of unpack that and be like, no, life is more complicated, but we do bring advantages to the table, right?
So one of the things that got me was he is so young, right? And that's why he can have such an emotional mental journey. But it was a really good writing technique to have him be so young and naive, because now you could have characters explaining bits of Nova Terra to him as like what would be info dumps, but are now like funny interactions that are building relationships. So I really love that writing technique here.
Good. I'm glad it didn't come across as info dumpy. That was sort of the fear I had, was that, I'm always sharing too much information, or I'm making it a little bit boring. But I do love the idea of sort of masking the communication between me and the reader as these moments where relationships are being strengthened and built and people are learning more about each other and, being able to share. Because again, I think that in real life, that's sort of what happens.
Yeah. And I just think these moments are so great because they also add to the comedy. Like, Mina is so funny and she talks so much, and then she'll just be like, I can't believe you don't know this.
Right. Yeah. She has been a joy to write. She is one of my favorite characters and has just really been, and without getting into any spoilers, because you're on book 5 of 10.
I know.
Well, I guess 13, almost 13 now. But without getting into any spoilers, like, I really had a good time with her character as well. And I really tried, especially for the core group, to leave nobody sort of untouched. Everybody is, in my head, the main character. They're all real in that sense. And so I tried as much as possible to help them also walk through changes as time went on.
With the core group, I can definitely feel that, but there are so many characters because it is a fantasy world.
Oh my
goodness. How do you even keep track?
Control F and going back and like scanning through. And honestly, a lot of people just show up and then fade away and never come back. And I had to, at some point, just be okay with it, right? And just say, you know what? I can't bring everybody back. There are some reoccurring characters who show up later, who, I really enjoyed that, like doing that. But for the most part, it's just sort of the core group. And then we're going to try as much as possible to remember what names I used for people, but yeah.
It's just got to be difficult because there's like so many names of places and then people and, and like I would just lose my mind if I was trying to write all this. I would have like an info sheet and then I would lose track of where I was on that.
Yeah. So one of the advantages I have is I have a Patreon community. And so often my patrons would remind me of plot points or remind me of characters and be like, whatever happened to this person? And I'd be like, oh, I better figure that out. Or they'd be like, what about this plot point? And so this is 2 books after that. And so I'm quickly in the chapters that I'm currently writing, like fixing those, plot holes and like closing it back in. So I have to say a lot of the credit for, especially in the later books, how sort of well tied together Nova Terra feels is because of a community of people who really loved it and were excited about contributing to it as well.
I think that is my favorite part about independent publishing or like self-publishing is you have these beta readers who are dedicated and they care. Like I'm sure regular publishers, you care somewhat, but it's like a constant influx of material. But like with Patreon, you can just pick somebody and be like, oh my God, I need to read this so bad that I don't care if it's edited yet.
That's exactly right. And the reality is that people contributing this, and this is sort of, I guess, a world building philosophy that I have, people contributing to my world and contributing to how the characters develop makes them better. This actually literally just happened yesterday and today. Yesterday, I wrote a chapter on Patreon for the 3rd book in the Tower series, which is sort of the continuation after Nova Terra. And I got more comments on it than any other chapter I have ever posted, I'm pretty sure. And I realized in that moment, because of what people were saying, that I had sort of a pacing problem. And so I was able to go back in and move a chapter around so that today the problem was solved, right? And I wouldn't have done that if not for having, again, this really committed group of people who are really invested in the characters and want to see the best come out of the world, right? Because I have one perspective of the world, but my readers bring their own perspectives as well. And so having that opportunity to sort of feed off of that or like create this feedback loop has just been an absolute blessing for my writing, I think.
Yeah, and this is essentially a workshop group, really.
Yeah,
I mean,
in a lot of ways.
They do help you workshop it, right?
Yes, and in a very real way, though it's often sort of subtle. People will make comments and like I'm always reading the comments. I'm always paying attention to how people are feeling about the chapters. And I had somebody, so another great example, I had somebody yesterday like send me a message and he just said, hey, like I trust that you're going to do something great with this, but like this is a little bit concerning for me. And as I read through it, I was like, oh, I didn't have that perspective when I wrote my chapter, when I wrote what I wrote. But seeing that perspective, like I can absolutely understand that perspective and I can absolutely sympathize with it. And so I need to make an adjustment so that I'm not communicating the wrong thing here. And that, again, just very helpful. I'm a huge believer in collaborative world building. I think, it's always true that more perspectives are going to help refine an idea further. Now, obviously, as the author, I have the final say in what happens. And, ultimately, it's my story to tell. But having that feedback and having that interaction with my audience has just been absolutely awesome. And again, it's really contributed. I think that is the reason that Nova Terra feels like a living and breathing world, because so many people have spoken into it.
I can definitely feel influences from a lot of different aspects. And even like I was thinking while Thorn was creating his characters, like his avatar, like, oh, what if somebody is non-binary or trans, maybe that 20% eats up that, and they can be whatever gender or not gender they want to be. So like, I was like, oh, I'll just make it this way.
Yeah, there's a lot of flexibility in world building, and one of the most magical things, and again, this gets into a little bit of my philosophy of world building, is that as an author, I write a story, but the world building is really done in the head of the reader, right? Anybody who reads a book is going to take it, and I do the same thing when I read a book. I'm going to take what's presented to me and I'm going to create the world in my own head. And so there's something really magical about being able to give people sort of the scaffolding for a world and then see them really, really enjoy it.
So one of the things that you mentioned from your Patreon was they told you that your pacing was off with this newest chapter that you put out.
Yes.
So I think your pacing is so good in the books that I've read so far. So now I'm wondering, like, how is your pacing bad?
So it really had to do with the emotional journey that underlies the plot, right? And one of the things that I realized pretty early is that I don't like books that are just plot or are just emotional journey, right? I want to see characters move and act, and I also want to see them grow and evolve. And so I had originally planned out a scene for sort of the end of the book that I'm currently working on as sort of a climactic thing. But then as people were sort of commenting on a chapter much earlier in the book, I realized, oh, wait, my characters are ready for this moment, right? And because of who they are, it's not going to be a giant climactic thing. It's instead going to be a small, subtle thing where they're just going to like have a real adult conversation about it. And then once they have that real adult conversation, that's what's actually necessary for the emotional journey, is for them to like find to close the distance as adults do, right? Because they're not kids anymore. They've grown up and they're in this new chapter of life. And so that's what they need to do. And so that was just really helpful, because I would have missed that. I would have, as I'm thinking about plot from like a writer's perspective, it's like put the big high impact moments towards the climax, right? But this is a really high impact moment that's going to give us a nice mini peak, right? A mini climax sort of at the proper point in the book for people to be like, oh, this is great. Like I'm invested, right? And so what I was planning on doing, I've just shifted and again, moved this up into that earlier section of the book. So it's really about balancing, for me at least, it's about balancing sort of the action with the emotional journey that the character is on.
It definitely feels like a good balance in your books, because things move quickly from like scene to scene, yes. But also you don't linger on things that the characters wouldn't linger on, like Hector and Thorn, when they first meet back up after Thorn kills Hector, they're just like, we're not going to talk about it, and Mina's like, this is so uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But they're like, it's fine, we're moving on.
Right. Yeah, because and part of that is like, I had a lot of thought myself about like, how should people treat death in this world? How should they look at it? Because like, it's a game, but it's a little bit more than a game, and like it's so tied into real life, and like, but at the same time, I think that there are masculine ways of dealing with problems and there are feminine ways of dealing with problems. And so like, understanding, and one's not necessarily better than the other, they're just different, but understanding that they are different, and that sometimes we need to cross those boundaries, right? Sometimes we need to take a more masculine approach or take a more feminine approach. I thought that was just a really interesting concept to play with. Again, trying to understand that conflict is really the sort of the crux of every relationship. And so introducing those little conflicts where maybe not everybody agrees with how everything's being done is totally fine, because that's how real life is.
So like those moments are the magical moments for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I just love them. They're so good. And you have a lot sprinkled throughout the books. So thank you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
So did you always have like a large story that you wanted to tell? Because it's 10 books in the first series, and now you're on a second series.
Yeah, about that. Um, Originally, Nova Terra was going to be 3 books.
Oh.
Book 1, book 2, and book 10. And that was the series. And then I got to the end of book 2 and I started book 3. And so the beginning of book 3 was originally going to be the beginning of book 10. And I started it because I was like, I'm just going to write a trilogy. I'm doing this for fun. Like at this point, it's just something to do. Well, I started book 3 and then it just kept getting longer and longer and longer and longer. And then I got to the end of book 3 and I was like, man, I didn't tell any of the story that I had that I was planning on telling. I didn't even get there yet. And then something happened at the end of book 3 that was really unexpected for me as the writer. So I'm a pantser. I just sort of discovery write. And I got to the end of book 3 and it just took a complete left turn from where I thought it was going to go. It didn't resolve the way I thought it would. And then book 4 just sort of naturally followed, and book 5 just sort of naturally followed. And then like I kept trying to get my characters back to the spot where I could start book 10. And it just took me books 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. And then I was there and I was like, haha. And so I ended like, I was like, okay, this is it. 10 books, series done. And then I realized that I liked the characters so much. I liked spending time with the characters so much that I just couldn't let it go. And so that's why we're back to it. And I'm having so much fun. It's I don't know if you've ever had the experience of like having friends who you spent time with when you were younger, and then you got to spend time with them as adults and you're all grown up and you're more mature and like you're better at life and like you're settled people, you know who you are, you're not all out exploring and trying to figure it out, and you can just be comfortable together, right? And that's sort of how I feel about these characters. They've grown up, they've gotten to the point where I'm like, okay, now we can go on real adventures.
Okay. I mean, it feels like these first 10 books are real adventures.
Well, I hope so. I hope so, because the adventures that we have who make us who we are so important, right? Those foundational stories about our lives that have turned us into who we are, I think are really, really important. And I wanted to give them full range, right? The full time to breathe, so to speak. But I have to admit, these new books that I'm writing for the Tower series are just so much fun. Like they're so much fun. Yeah.
Well, I originally bought the first one, Forge Master, and
Oh
that's
yeah,
what I
yeah.
started listening to. And I was like, oh crap, this is in the middle of like a character
Yeah.
progression.
I did my best with Forge Master to make it so that you could listen to it technically without, and you'd miss a couple of people. You'd be like, I don't know who these people are, and I don't know why these relationships are working the way they're working. But by the time you get through the first book, the second book, well, really the first book, you should have enough of the story that you can sort of pick it up at that point. I definitely think it helps to go back and read books 1 through 10, but that's also a huge commitment. 10 books is a lot of books. So,
Well, after book 3, I just bought all the books.
Oh, thank you.
And I was like, okay, I'm committed now. So, and
Thank
then
you.
my boyfriend is really obsessed too, but he's a book behind me.
Okay.
We started at the same time, but he works like a normal job that you actually have to pay attention to during the day. And so he's behind me a little bit, and I want to talk to him so bad. And I'm like, you need to catch up. Um,
That's awesome.
yeah. So I'm really excited to like get to the end of Nova Terra and then start
Yeah.
Forge Master again.
Yeah. Well, it's a pretty wild ride.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a pretty wild ride.
So there was something else. Oh, Thorns' age. Okay, so he starts 16
Yes.
and then he's in game for 2 real years, and there's time dilation in the game, so he'll be in for like, what is it, 14 years
14 years. Yes.
mentally? Yeah.
Yes.
Um, but then one of the characters starts to feel romantic about him.
Yes. I realized that I had a major problem in how I had written these characters because Thorin is not really a 16-year-old mentally,
No.
right? And he's sort of one of those kids who has seen too much and gone through too much and had to grow up a bit faster, right? And so he's not really 16 mentally. And as the series progresses, and I realized pretty early on that I had a major problem, right? Because of sort of how I had written these characters. And I I don't remember exactly which book it is. I think it's 7. I think it's book 7. Maybe book 8. No, I think it's book 7. Um, society as a whole, and this is sort of a micro spoiler, but it
That's
doesn't have
okay.
to do with anything else except for this specific issue because again, it was a problem, right? Because Thorn is underage, and like there's no getting around that. Is that there's a law is passed that counts time spent in time dilation as actual time. And so if you spend a year in Nova Terra, you count as a year older, even in the real world. And so people are accelerating their aging in the real world for sort of legal matters, right? Because they realize that somebody who experiences time 7 times faster is going to be mentally 7 times older, right? Regardless of physically how they are, their brain is moving at a faster rate. And so I did that again, I think in book 7, specifically to address this issue. But the other thing is that I just tried to be incredibly careful with how I handled the relationships.
Yeah.
And Thorn specifically is not interested in romance. And partly that was because of this problem, that like this corner that I wrote myself into, where it was like, nah, he's definitely underage, and we ain't about that. So that was but that was actually also something that very early on I knew I had to deal with because my patrons picked up on it.
Ooh.
One of them was like, time out, Seth. Like, what are you doing? And I was like, oh no. Oh no. It was, yeah. So that was one of those things where I just tried to be very careful about sort of the relationship. Also understanding that like people don't turn 18 and then magically feelings appear, right? Like every single person ever has experienced being a 16-year-old with raging hormones. Like that's a real thing. But you also want to be a little bit careful, with how you handle that, and especially when the other character is older, right? And you know, it's one of those weird things because like the older you get, the less it matters. But when you're young and the other person is like a third of your age older than you, it's you have to you just have to be really careful. And that's if I had to sort of outline a regret that I had about the series, it's actually that specific issue is that
Okay.
I feel like I didn't realize it early enough and I should have made an adjustment faster than I did. But it is, you know, it is what it is.
I mean, that's what
What else?
happens when you write a story, though. Like things progress in
Yeah.
natural ways. So, like, if that's not a subplot, that's just something that happens, then like
Mhm.
it's hard to predict.
Right. No, absolutely. Absolutely. And especially when you write in sort of this discovery style, my the best parts of my book come out of left field. I don't know that they're coming, right? I'm sitting down and writing, and then all of a sudden, like one of the characters will say something or do something, and I'm like, whoa, where did that come from? But it's right. It fits the natural progression of the story. And so, yeah, that's sort of, but
How about
I do feel a little bit like I wish that I had been more cognizant of that before going into it. I think it's handled by the end of the series. It works. Um, yeah.
even at the point I'm at now, he's like 17 years
Yep.
old, and they just make fun of her for being like protective of him and like
Yeah.
you they just tease her. It's funny.
Right. And I did try to like make some ambiguity
Yeah.
in their relationship. You know, is this like maternal instinct? Like what's, you know, what's going on here? Um, but it's also been, again, it's really cool being this deep in a series because the characters are so well developed. Like there's so many pieces to them and facets to them that it's just really fun to write. And I
How
hope it's
have
fun to read too.
I think it's fun to read. Obviously, I think it's fun. I was like on book 2 and I was like, do I message him now? Do I message now?
Well,
This is
I'm
going to be
always happy to
weird.
talk about them. Yeah.
Um how often do you find yourself writing yourself into corners though with
Pretty
like
often.
okay, cuz this like
Yeah.
discovery method is difficult when
Yeah.
you're trying to get somewhere.
Yeah. And I'll often run myself, well, less into a corner and more into a, I don't know how to transition from this into where I want to go. Um, but I do think that again, it produces some really organic feeling stories. You know, and again, there are pluses and minuses to both sides. With discovery writing, you end up with this more organic story. You know, I think character interactions tend to be more organic, but with a heavier plotting style, you can be more intricate in the plot, right? So like my foreshadowing isn't as good as some authors that I read, and it's because I don't necessarily plot. Now sometimes there are happy coincidences, and you know, that's really great. And sometimes my subconscious like sets something up without me even realizing it, and then later I'm like, oh, this is how I can connect it all. But I do write myself into corners, and often it just requires a little bit of time to let my mind work through the story. You know, people sort of joke about like the best ideas come in the shower, but it's actually true. And often it's because my brain is like working on the problem without me realizing that it's working on the problem. And so all of a sudden it'll be like, oh, this is how I fix this specific issue. And then it's off to the races again. You know, I can go, excuse me, I can go and I can continue to explore.
I think the nature of independent publishing too is that at least for lit RPG, it seems like authors are trying to produce at least one book a year, maybe two, to try and keep readers invested. And so you can't really do these long thought out like plots, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like you just can't, because you have to constantly be writing, it feels like.
Yeah. I think that that is absolutely true. And I think that we have, in the lit RPG space, have borrowed a lot from the web serial world. And in the web serial world, you don't plot in the same way that you would a traditional novel, because they go on forever, right? The story is designed to just keep going. And so you don't have these nice, neat little stories that are sort of a snippet of somebody's life. You have these giant, sprawling, like long-term commitments. And so I think in lit RPG specifically, we've sort of borrowed this idea because honestly, people like it. Like people enjoy reading it. And I think it's one of the things that has made lit RPG such a hot genre right now. Like it's blowing up, and weirdly, like often genres have like a 2-year lifespan, and this one just keeps growing. It's like, yeah.
It is quite bizarre. Like I don't know what publisher it was, one of the big five. They had like a lit RPG-esque book on sale, and I was like, what is happening right now?
Yeah. Listen, I think it's going to the moon. I think that this is going to be the next epic fantasy. I think for a long time, epic fantasy has been like the cornerstone of fantasy. And I think lit RPG is coming for it.
I think so lit RPG for me is so much easier to read because I can go off on these side quests, and it feels natural. Like, oh, you ran into a roadblock. You can't just keep going, bringing the ring to Mordor. Like, you have to do other things to keep working. Yeah.
Right. And I also think that it just, it fits our time. Like, we know what gaming is. We're sort of scattered, as a society, we're sort of scattered. Like, we're always going off on side quests. We're always like distracted by the shiny object and heading a different direction, right? And this is just a style of writing that really lends itself to sort of culturally where we are. And so I think that I'm really happy to be writing in lit RPG. And the other thing that I love about it, as I get on my soapbox here, the other thing that I love about lit RPG is that I can write different kinds of books. So I have this, this VR story, this sort of, high adventure romp. And I'm also writing, though, a sort of a cosmic horror light lit RPG, and I'm writing like a pure fantasy lit RPG, and like I'm writing all of these other things and getting to do that. I'm about to write a sort of a Western lit RPG, and so it just, there's a lot of stuff that you can do that fits in the genre. And that's not only good as an author because I get to write all sorts of different things, but I feel like even as a reader, it's fantastic because I can read a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and I'm not, stuck into every book is going to follow the exact same template. We have the comedy and we have the, the really dark and gritty and like every shade in between. And it's just really fun.
Where do you put Battle Mage Farmer? And
so I would say Battle Mage Farmer is like, I mean, it's it started as slice of life, like a slice of life story. And that's sort of a weird story, actually, because like I had the idea about a year and a half before I wrote it. And then when I wrote it, like, excuse me, three other farming books came out right around it. And so there were 4 of us who released these farming books. And so like, Help I Reincarnated as a Farmer, was fantastic. And then Beware of Chicken, you know, also fantastic. And then Wolf Lock series, so good. Like, but they all just hit at the same time. But it's definitely slice of life. I think it gets less slice of lifey as you go. It starts sort of ramping up into sort of, you know, the classic adventure or fantasy. And part of that is just because it ended up being longer than 3 books. So that sort of, I had to make some adjustments to it. But we are going to get back to slice of life, I promise, for anybody who's annoyed at me for changing that series.
So I love slice of life, and I love like, I know he's probably not, but Travis Baldree being the impetus of like cozy fantasy.
Sure. Yeah,
but
yeah.
It feels like because he did so much lit RPG that he's just like, to me, it is just part of that community.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So I love that
Absolutely
there's
awesome.
like this broad spectrum of lit
Yes,
RPG or game lit, and it's just amazing.
I think so.
Yeah.
It's really a fun community to be part of.
It can be frustrating. I'm not going to lie.
Yeah.
So there's like so many different groups on Facebook now when there
Yes.
used to be 2.
Yeah, that is another you know, and that's always going to happen, right? People are going to sort of find their specific subgroup as these groups get bigger and bigger and bigger, as the genre gets bigger. It does make it a little bit harder though to find new things as they come out. You know, and there are stories, or there are series that like it'll pop up on my feed sometimes, or another author will mention it to me, and I'm like, they're on book 4. I didn't even know there was a book 1. Like, where did this
Right?
come from? But as you said, in lit RPG, posting or like release schedules tend to be pretty quick.
Yeah.
Like for most of my series, it's like a 3-month gap, right? So each book comes out 3 months after the previous one. But I've got multiple series coming out, and so these books are coming out like all the time. So I do think that, and other people are doing exactly the same thing, right? That's not uncommon in the space.
Yeah.
And so there is some saturation happening, but because the genre is growing and expanding and there are always new readers coming in, I don't think we've sort of hit the point where like we're now oversaturated and it's going to start fading.
No, I don't think so at all. In fact, I think it's just going to keep getting more and more popular,
Yeah,
at least for a good long while.
I think so. I'm
Um,
hoping so.
I'm just waiting for the lit RPG movie.
Yeah, oh, it's coming. Yeah, who knows, you know, whose it will be. But I definitely think it's coming. You
Yeah.
know, there's some lit RPG that are hitting pretty big. And you know, progression fantasy isn't lit RPG,
Yeah.
but it's close enough and there's enough crossover that if somebody gets sucked into a progression fantasy, they'll often trickle over into lit RPG. Or if they start reading lit RPG, they'll get sucked into like the progression fantasy group. And I love that. I absolutely love that there's that tie-in and that crossover, because I think it helps everybody.
I do appreciate that there's like a lot of little niches, because
Mm-hmm.
I'm not particularly a progressive fantasy type of person. So
Mm-hmm.
like isekai is not really my jam.
Gotcha.
But it is a huge part of the genre. And I'm
Yes.
like, oh, well, I can just switch to Seth Ring, or I can
Yeah.
go to so
Yeah.
many other people.
And one of the things that I love doing, and I'm doing this more and more and more with my stories, is I am taking elements that are very recognizable on the surface, and then I'm just telling the story that I want to tell sort of inside that space. Somebody actually I think it was Eric Ugland
Mhm.
was saying that lit RPG is really just a literary device that you attach to a story, right? It's sort of the window dressing. on the story. And you can tell the story, you could tell all of these stories just as a regular fantasy, but we add the little bit of window dressing to make it fit into this wider subgenre, because we all enjoy it. You know, and I think that's where, when you are coming from a place of loving the thing you're making, it's just so much better.
I really love the idea of it being a literary device instead of just a subgenre, because it does feel like a framing device for
Yes.
whatever story you're trying to tell.
Yeah.
So I do like that idea. Maybe I'll keep that in my noggin. So you have all these writing projects going on.
Yeah.
But now you also have a YouTube channel.
I do have a YouTube channel.
You do.
And it's fun.
You talk a lot about a lot of the same things I asked you here.
Yeah, I do. Actually, YouTube is really fun for me. And I don't know, when you start a YouTube channel, all of the advice is like, pick a subgenre, or like pick a niche and like stick to it and like do it hard and like talk about that thing. And I've been finding that I just really like to talk. And so mostly I've just been talking about whatever, and so sometimes it's like life stuff, and sometimes it's writing stuff, and sometimes it's neither. But it's also a great platform for connecting with people. And I am, again, as I was mentioning earlier, part of my world building philosophy is the more people involved, the better. And I think life in general, I feel that way. The more people whose lives I can speak into and who can speak into my life in return, the better. So I'm all about that.
That's a beautiful philosophy. So what are you working on next? So you're still doing the Tower series, and then Battle Mage Farmer, right? Or is that done?
So I have 3 active projects right now. The Tower series, I'm working on book 3 right now. I've finished book 5 of Battle Mage Farmer, so I'm about to start working on book 6. I have a new series coming out in the fall. It's actually going up on Royal Road on Saturday. So like this week, it's going up on Royal Road, and it's already started posting to my Patreon, called Dreamer's Throne. And that's a story about a guy who wakes up in the body of a prince in a fantasy world, or not a prince, but like a nobleman in a fantasy world. But his legs don't work and he's missing an arm, and he's sort of stuck in the middle of this city with nobody to help him. And so he has to survive. But there's a dream world that starts leaking into reality that he has to worry about as well. So anyway, that's a little bit of got a bit of a horror overtone, and that's been super fun to write. But that will come out. The first book in that series will come out in September, sometime. It'll come out in the fall.
That works.
But I'm gonna work. Yeah, I'm gonna work on writing the others in that series, because again, it is posting to Patreon. I post all of my content to Patreon pretty much. The only thing I don't post is Battle Mage Farmer. But then I also just finished another Nova Terra story. It's a side story about Alf and about how he got his start in Nova Terra. And so it's called Mad Master Alchemist. And I think it's going to actually, I don't think it's actually been announced yet. Oh, so I might be spoiling. It's going to be coming out in the next month or two. It is finished and it's ready to go. But that's really fun. And I'm really excited over the next year or 2 years to start exploring some of those other side stories. Maybe figure out how the Society of Roses came together and grew to the position it did. Maybe run an adventure with Corvo and, see how he ended up where he is, and maybe talk about the avatars a little bit more. And there are some other characters, specifically some of the villains. Ouroboros, I'd love to explore what happens to him after we stop hearing from him, after he sort of vanishes. It would be great to just start trying to, learn more about these characters. Nova Terra is such a fun world to explore. So I'm really excited to continue writing in it, even as I, continue Thorns' story. Um, I I think that, yeah, I have so many projects either going or about to start. Um, Writing's so fun.
Well, I'll have to join your Patreon so I know when everything comes out, and then I'll get to pre-read.
Yeah, absolutely. And not only do you get to pre-read if you're on Patreon, but you actually get to contribute as well. Like I said, I really value Patreon feedback. And so a lot of times I'll also throw polls up like, hey, what do you think should happen in this situation? When do you want certain people to be involved? And, who goes on this adventure? That was one of my sort of the regular things I asked throughout the Titan series is which of the characters, because like you said, gigantic cast, but which of the characters is going to get to go on this adventure with Thorn? And my patrons were really good about helping me figure that out. So Patreon is a great time. I also have a Discord that people can jump onto and talk about all of this stuff. There are Patreon specific channels, but there's also general channels for anybody. If you don't want to become a patron, you can still jump on and talk to us and give us suggestions and all that kind of stuff.
Well, that is fantastic. There's many ways to reach you.
Yes. I try to make myself accessible.
There is one thing you don't have, though.
Oh, yeah?
Merch.
Yeah, I've tried a couple of times, but often I just am like,
it's not worth it.
I do think that no, actually I think I took my store down because I was tired of having to deal with it and ship things. Some people have been asking me to go on Redbubble and I think it's called Redbubble and like pop up a store there. So maybe I'll do that. But I do need some merch.
I just want a poster of the book cover for Forge Master. It is such good art.
Isn't it amazing?
I love it.
I was really happy with that. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been an absolute blast chatting.
And if anybody out in my audience hasn't read yet Nova Terra, I highly, highly suggest it, obviously. I am in the throes of Nova Terra. So go check out Seth Ring's page, sethring.com, right?
Yep.
Yeah. And his YouTube, and have a great day.